One of the major economic concerns that people have about artificial intelligence is the way that much human labor could become obsolete, being replaced by automated machine labor. This lecture will consider several major aspects of how that has happened in the past and what some of the abstract general economic implications of that have been, and some ways that artificial intelligence might be different, but I'm not going to focus too much on concrete details because the future is different from the past, and I think it's more useful to think in general abstract terms. So the main concepts that I want to go through in this video are the meaning of unemployment, why it's a bad thing, the Jevons paradox, Baumol's cost disease, and the implications of automation on domestic work. And for those middle two, I'll explain what they are when we get there. There are, of course, many other aspects of the impact of automation on employment that often benefit from a more detailed study of specific types of automation and specific types of employment. But I want to focus on the broader theoretical topics that are likely to be worth thinking about in many contexts, rather than on specialized topics whose significance may be temporary. So the basic worry is this. Since the Industrial Revolution, most people spend most of their waking time that's outside the house working for money. This work is the main source of the resources that they need to provide goods and services for themselves and also for the younger and older and other members of their household. And also, this has historically been, it's become central to most people's self-conception, that they think of themselves in terms of their job, and their main social interactions are through their job, and so on. Thus, even though work itself is often an activity that people don't especially enjoy, the idea of not having work is even more of a threat in this industrial era, both to the material quality of life, because work is how you get money that gets you goods and services, and to their emotional or spiritual quality of life, because work is how you define yourself and work is where you find your friends and social life. And so the state of not having work has become conceptualized as a problem, namely the problem of unemployment. And I think it's important to note that the state of not being employed for wages outside the home is not by itself inherently problematic. For the majority of human history, the vast majority of people have not had anything like what we call a job, and they haven't thought of that in particular as a problem. In different periods of human history before the Industrial Revolution, goods and services were provided in other ways, and meaning was provided in other ways. In the industrial era, it's true, employment has done a better job of providing goods and services to people than subsistence farming did, which is what people did during the agricultural revolution. And in the hunter-gatherer period, people did other things. And the industrial era has eventually provided better goods and services even than the hunting-gathering era did. But it is important to keep an open mind about how future humans might seek goods and services or meaning in life, independent of work. Now, during the industrial era, there's been an important tension in the role of mechanization and the automation of work. Without mechanization, there's very few goods and services that a person can provide more effectively than by engaging in subsistence farming. So mechanization was essential for the Industrial Revolution and the idea of a job to even become a thing. That mechanization is essential for the idea of work outside the home to be a widespread possibility. But if a fixed amount of work is being done, then further mechanization reduces the amount of labor needed, and thus often means that people who once were working now are out of work. So automation was necessary to create the job, and then it seems to destroy the job. In the 1860s, the economist William Stanley Jevons was looking at related issues, initially not for labor, but for coal in particular. He was one of the first people to explicitly think not just about how quickly can you mine coal, how quickly can you bring it to the factories, but also how much coal is left and whether it might run out at some point. And so he was specifically looking at various techniques and technologies that had increased the efficiency of coal-powered processes to see how much they had extended the lifespan of coal mines. But one of the things he discovered is that they often had the opposite effect. When more efficient techniques were introduced, efficiency did not mean that consumption went down, but actually consumption went up. And we can think about it like this. If it takes a ton of coal to make 10 pounds of steel, then that helps set the price of steel, that every pound of steel is going to require you to pay for a huge amount of coal. And so people will only make things out of steel when steel is so much more effective than the alternative that it justifies buying that much coal to burn. Maybe you'll use steel for bridges and for the frames of buildings where its material properties are especially important. But if it took that much coal to make steel, we would not have steel uh, spoons and forks at home. We would make them out of a cheaper material. But once a ton of coal can produce 100 pounds of steel or 1,000 pounds of steel or a ton of steel, then steel gets cheaper and we start to use steel for a lot more purposes. And so Jevons noted this paradox that when consumption becomes more efficient, often people start consuming more, and then often the underlying good whose consumption became more efficient can sometimes go up. Increased efficiency can lead to increased usage. Doesn't always happen, but at least sometimes does, and we need to pay attention to this paradox. And interestingly, something like this seems to have happened not just with the use of coal in textile production in the Industrial Revolution, but also with employment. That picture there on the right is the area known as Cottonopolis, which was an early collection of cotton mills that were powered by coal. And by the end of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people were working there. Before industrialization, most people only wore clothing that was made inside their own household. They might have grown the flax that they got the fibers from and spun into yarn and then wove the yarn into fabric and then sewed the fabric together into their clothes. Or it might be from sheep that they grew and then went through all those processes of combing out the fibers, spinning them into thread, weaving the thread into cloth, sewing it together. And if you have to go through all that work for every single piece of clothing that you wear, then that means each individual item of clothing is very valuable. That has many, many hours of human labor embodied in that. And so you knew if you damaged a piece of clothing, you or your mother or grandmother or someone else who lives in your household is going to have to go through all that work to replace that clothing. And so you would be very careful with your clothing, and you would only wear the minimum number of items of clothing that you needed. And you would keep re-wearing it day after day after day and try to make it last a long time. But as industrialization progressed, individual workers could start making large amounts of thread in a day instead of just as much as they could spin by hand. They could supervise a mechanical loom that was burning coal to weave cloth really quickly instead of being limited by the speed of a human passing the shuttle back and forth. And one person could now, with the help of some coal, do the work of several people, or dozens of people, or eventually hundreds and thousands of people. Over the several decades, new machines kept being developed that enabled fewer workers and less coal to produce more clothing. When just as much work can be done with less coal, we talk about it as efficiency, while when just as much work can be done with less labor, we usually talk about it as productivity. And by the early 19th century, in Britain at least, there was an industry that employed tens of thousands of workers who made their living making clothing. And then, as new techniques were developed that enabled even greater efficiency and productivity, workers were worried that they would lose their job, while people like Jevons were hopeful that they would save coal. After all, everyone already has clothing. So if the workers are twice as efficient and only half as much coal is needed, then maybe we could do the same amount of clothing with just half as many workers and half as much coal. But by the middle of the century, there were over 1 million workers working in textile mills in Britain, and coal demand was skyrocketing. It turns out that these greater efficiencies and productivities meant the clothing became cheaper. And so people started buying multiple suits of clothing that they could wear, so they could wear different things on different days or on different occasions. They could have clean clothing without having to do the washing as often, and they could have clothing that looks different. Although clothing took less labor and coal to produce and less money to buy, people were spending more money on clothing, and there were more workers employed and more coal was used producing it. Now, perhaps a more representative case to look at might be the case of musicians in the United States in the 20th century. So in the first half of the 20th century, uh, the productivity of musicians was drastically increasing due to recording, amplification, and broadcast. It used to be that if you had a few musicians together, they could provide enough music for a few dozen people to dance in the room, or if the people were listening quietly in a concert hall, maybe a few thousand people could hear the musicians playing. But once you have amplification, a few musicians can actually provide enough music for an arena full of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And with recording and broadcasting, a single performance of the music can provide the music for many occasions for millions of people. And so you might have thought all this increased productivity of music, where a single performance, just a few hours of work by a few dozen musicians, can produce enough music for millions and millions and millions of hours of listening, you might have thought this would drastically reduce the jobs for musicians. After all, in the 19th century, there would be a little band at every bar, and every major event would have live music. Well, today, it's pretty uncommon that most people go to see live music. But the US Census was tracking the number of people employed as musicians in several of the decades of the census. I was able to find records from 1900 to 1960 and again in 2010, unfortunately not for the intervening years. I wish I could find that period because that's when the discotheque was invented, and it meant that the number of performers needed for people to dance to went down. You'd only need a single DJ at a bar as opposed to a whole band at every bar. But even with this incomplete data, we can see there was a general rough increasing trend, maybe a bit of a decrease in the second half of the 20th century, but not below the beginning of the century. Uh, and the issue is that even though there's more people that are able to listen to any given performance, there's now a lot more uses for music that didn't exist in the 19th century. Now that music can be recorded for cheap, an advertiser can commission someone to write a song, and they can play that song every time they play the ad. Elevators can afford to have music. Waiting rooms can have music. You would never have had a live band in the waiting room of a doctor's office if you had to hire all the musicians to play there. But if you can just buy a recording, you can do that. And so most of us listen to so much more music than anyone did a century ago that all these new forms of recordings actually provide as many jobs as all the music jobs at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, a lot of that music is not usually thought of as particularly artistic. No one goes into music because they want to make advertising jingles or elevator music. But there is new artistic music being made for TV shows and movies and video games, which most people today spend a lot more time watching and listening to than they ever did to live theater or live music in the period before recording made it affordable. Now, obviously, the total population of the United States increased by a factor of 4 or 5 over this period. So the fact that the number of musicians only doubled does mean that there was effectively some amount of technological job loss here. But not as much, not nearly as much as you would have expected by the productivity increases. In this case, we didn't have the full Jevons paradox. We didn't have demand increasing even as efficiency increased. It just meant that the demand didn't decline by nearly as much as efficiency increased. Now, we don't know what productivity improvements due to AI will be like, and whether they will on net lead to reduced employment, like we have for horse drivers these days, or to increased employment, like we did in the textile industry, or to something like stagnation like we have in music. But productivity improvements are basically always benefits to the consumer, who can either consume more of the goods that are being produced, or they can save their spending power for other goods and services. But for the workers, they can end up being either wins or losses. Now, a related labor market phenomenon connected to productivity growth is based on the fact that at any time when productivity is improving, there are technologies that are improving productivity in some industries, like in clothing in the early 19th century or in music in the 20th century. And there are other kinds of of employment for which technology is not improving productivity. And William Baumol is an economist who noted that, in particular, his observation was over the course of the 20th century, the number of audience members that could fit into a concert hall to hear a live performance of a Beethoven string quartet remained the same. No one's going there to listen to an amplified string quartet. So the audience size stays the same, and they haven't invented any technology that allows a live performance of a string quartet to be done by fewer than 4 people. So there was zero productivity increase for string quartets. Meanwhile, other kinds of musical activities, like listening to recorded music or attending rock concerts, did have productivity increases. And non-musical ones, like making clothing or growing food or delivering goods, have had tremendous productivity increases over the course of the 20th century. And so what he noted is in the sectors where there are productivity increases, prices come down for consumers, and also wages go up for the workers because they're producing more valuable goods. And so that's why people who are working in working class jobs in the modern era are not in the same sort of poverty that they were a century ago. Their wages have gone up, partly due to their productivity increases. And although the number of dollars that it costs to get food or deliver goods has gone up, after adjusting for inflation, prices of goods and transportation have gone way down. Now, you might have thought that in the sectors without productivity increases, like string quartet performances, maybe the prices would stay constant and the wages would stay constant. But actually, because wages have gone up in all the other economic sectors, wages for string quartet players have to go up. If you couldn't make any more money playing in a string quartet today than you could a century ago, then anyone who has the skills to play in a string quartet today would use those skills for something else where they wouldn't be in poverty, and they would likely leave the sector entirely. So wages must go up even in the sectors that are technologically stagnant in order to compete with wages in other industries. And so going to see a string quartet perform live is now a very expensive activity because you have to pay those workers a lot more than you did a century ago, but still only the same number of people are getting it. And so Baumol called this effect the cost disease. In sectors that stagnate in productivity, the goods become more expensive because wages are increasing. And now, because there isn't any special reason for most people to see a string quartet performed live, this has become a much rarer activity than it was a century ago because it's now expensive, whereas a century ago it was not so expensive. And some people have said this might be an explanation of why modern buildings don't look as beautiful as older ones. And the new pictures that I put up here on the left and right, these are the same building. This is Pennsylvania Station in New York City. This is the main way that anyone who enters New York City on a railroad enters the city. On the left, we have the station as it was constructed in 1910. And then in the middle of the century, it was torn down and replaced with the one that we see on the right in 1963. And some of the differences between these structures, I mean, everyone agrees the one on the left is beautiful, and it was one of the architectural wonders of the world. Whereas the one on the right, everyone hates Penn Station these days. Now, some of the differences between the two are due to the fact that in the rebuilding, they also put a sports stadium on top, Madison Square Garden. And so there's just less space for those really high ceilings. But some of it is also due to the cost of labor, which has led to some of the broader stylistic changes between these buildings. In 1910, labor was cheap, and so hiring a bunch of people to carve ornate stonework was not as big an expense as actually getting the stone. Whereas by 1963, you would have to pay workers a lot for that, while the cost of shipping stone would have gone down, and the work is really the difference. And you see that in other aspects of construction. In 1910, at the same time as they built Penn Station, they also built the railroad tracks into town, and dozens of workers were killed in accidents in that construction. Whereas by 1963, safety standards were higher, and they expect zero fatalities in most building construction. And so it's rare to see modern buildings with intricate ceilings and columns and stonework in countries where there's high wages. You might occasionally still see it in countries that haven't adapted the full modern uh, productivity and pay scale. But for other goods and services that are more essential than stonework or string quartets, cost disease has become a significant issue. So here I've got two different charts that are illustrating the prices of various goods and services over the past several decades. I believe both of these are in the United States. And the chart on the left is showing from 1950 to the 2010s. The chart on the right is just showing from 1997 to the 2010s. And in both of these charts, what we generally see is that manufactured goods like clothing, shoes, appliances, electronics, prices just keep going down and down and down because productivity keeps increasing. Whereas any sort of services, whether it's childcare, education, healthcare, even things like car repair, those have tended to get more expensive because for most of those, there's just no innovations that have increased productivity. So think about childcare. Uh, how has technology helped the childcare worker? There's probably some more efficiency on the bookkeeping side, but still the basic product of the childcare industry is you need a human adult to watch a couple children. And you don't want a single adult to be trying to watch 30 children, 50 children, 100 children. It's still one adult per few children. And as adult wages have increased, that means the cost of childcare is going to increase. Similarly for education, there was all sorts of talk about the promise of online education and massive classes, but in general, that has not been where people choose to get their education. In the sectors where people choose to get their education, it's still a few students per professor on average, and the same in high schools. Uh, in healthcare, there has been massive increase in productivity for things like cancer treatment or curing certain diseases, but these are new, expensive treatments for things that couldn't be treated at all before. For the basic aspects of healthcare, where someone is just lying in a hospital bed waiting to recover after their surgery, there's still only so many patients that a single nurse can take care of, and so the price of nursing in particular is going to go way up. And unlike string quartets or beautiful buildings, these can't become niche markets that people just abandon and replace with something cheaper. And so the lack of productivity increases in these fields actually means an increasing fraction of all employees are now working in education or healthcare compared to manufacturing, where the number of employees is going down. Wages are still rising, but a larger and larger section of people's budget is now being consumed by these sectors where productivity has not increased. If AI causes changes in which fields are having productivity increases, then it'll reshape this whole possible set of Baumol's cost disease. Will the services in the care industry become even more expensive because AI still can't substitute? Or will AI maybe be able to substitute for human labor in some of these things, even better perhaps than it does for automation of manufacturing, so that maybe it can undo some of these changes? We don't know. Now, one other thing to keep in mind, beyond the compensation of workers and the prices for consumers, is the role of work in providing meaning in life. This may seem incidental, but it really isn't. And so I'm going to talk about a historical example, specifically about work within the household, where people weren't getting paid for that kind of work. So the result of changes in productivity within the household is not going to change anyone's earnings. So even though employment outside the home has been standard for men during the Industrial Revolution, there were long periods during which women in certain social classes did not work for pay outside the home, but instead were expected to do all the domestic work of keeping the home running. But in the early 20th century, automation transformed this work just as much as it transformed work outside the home. In 1920, only about a third of US households had electricity, only about half had natural gas and running water. And if you didn't have those things, then if you want to do anything like cook or wash your clothes or take a bath, you would have to go down to the well, fetch water, bring the water upstairs, put it in the place you're doing it, then load up the fire with wood or coal, burn it, do the work that you're trying to do by hand, and then when you're done, you have to be constantly cleaning up the ashes from the wood and the coal. Only 20% of households had a flush toilet. Anyone else would have to empty chamber pots or use an outhouse. The vacuum cleaner, the washing machine, the refrigerator, these things didn't exist. If you wanted fresh food, you would either need to shop every single day or grow your own food, or you would have to manage home ice deliveries. Over the course of the early 20th century, modern automation technology spread throughout US households. By 1960, 93% of US households had running water, 99% had electricity, 98% had refrigerators, 87% had flush toilets, 40% even had washing machines for their clothing, and 10% of them even had dishwashing machines. And homemakers had been doing all this work in the early 20th century without pay. So all these new machines automating the household uh, got rid of a lot of this household work. This didn't mean anyone lost any pay, but it may well have caused other problems. In 1963, Betty Friedan published her famous book, The Feminine Mystique, arguing that middle-class housewives, even ones with a loving relationship with husband and children, were suffering what she called the problem that has no name, which was sort of a lack of fulfillment from being cooped up inside the household. Now, many critics of the book emphasized that she was generalizing about the experience of women in general based on just the experience of upper middle class heterosexual white women who were married. But this group of women that she was talking about is precisely the group of women who most likely were put out of work by machines. At the beginning of the 20th century, even the women in this class would have been doing a lot of household work. Uh, but now, by 1960, they were experiencing a form of technological unemployment. This didn't cost them their pay, but it made them wonder, why am I in the household? What can I be doing with my life? And this book was part of the second wave feminist movement of the 1960s. One of the major calls she was issuing was for women to be accepted in roles outside the home. And if we look at this chart in the center, this is showing women's and men's employment over the course from 1950, I believe, to the present. And we can see over the next several decades, women did start to join the workforce in nearly equal numbers to men. Now, men gradually dropped out of the workforce, though this is people over age 20. And so a part of that is over this course of time, a lot more people have continued their schooling past age 20. So that's several percent of the people who moved out of work. And also, people are now living many more years in retirement. And so that's another several percent of people who are not working outside of the home. Uh, so uh, the fact that a version of this sort of problem of unemployment arose even when the labor that was displaced was not for pay suggests that we should be thinking not just about the problem of pay when we think about unemployment. We should be thinking about how do people derive meaning and fulfillment in their life. Now, the fact that schooling and retirement activities are often able to give people that kind of meaning should help us think about what other sorts of meaning are possible if automation does reduce the amount of people who are involved in labor. But I do want to leave off with one cautionary note about our thinking about how automation might affect employment in the future and the role of employment in human welfare, both in terms of earning wages that provide people access to goods and services and in providing meaning to life. So all of the reasoning that we've been doing so far is historicist reasoning. We are observing that in the past, well, at least in the past 2 centuries, wage labor has been the means by which we distribute goods and services and by which most people provide meaning and fulfillment in their life. We observe over the course of these 2 centuries various ways that automation has affected employment. Sometimes it leads to decreases in employment. Sometimes, due to Jevons paradox, it leads to increases in employment. We have observed that sometimes increases in productivity in some fields have caused other areas of economic activity to become more expensive, and in some cases changed the amount of consumption of these various areas. But the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, argued in his book, The Poverty of Historicism, that this sort of reasoning is inherently going to fail in certain ways when we try to predict the future, and in particular when it comes to social trends that are shaped by science and technology. Now, he wrote his book specifically as a critique of both Marxists and fascists who thought that they had a scientific theory of history. And so the Marxists claimed there was a natural law in the progression of history from feudalism to a bourgeois capitalist economy to Marxism or communism. And the fascists thought their own movement was the unfolding of the will of history. But Popper's criticisms apply just as well to anyone who thinks that we can predict the future on the basis of the past, whether it's the capitalists who say that we can see how technology has shaped society in the past and assume it'll do the same thing in the future, or to the progressives who say the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. In all of these cases, he notes that the structure of human history is shaped, at least in part, by scientific and technological discoveries. There are sometimes structural similarities between how different innovations might fit into an existing social structure, but occasionally these innovations are going to reshape the social structure itself in a way that we can't predict. Importantly, if we were to try to predict it, if we were to predict how a discovery or innovation would reshape society, we would have to know what that discovery or innovation is. And if we already knew it, then it wouldn't be a discovery. So we have to have some amount of humility about any sort of prediction about what automation will do in the future on the basis of what it's done in the past. All of the trends that we've observed are within a very specific period in history, namely the industrial era since 1800 or so. There has been some amount of structural similarity between each of these changes, but if things change more drastically, as some visions of artificial intelligence suggest that they will, then things could go very differently. Regardless, the idea that we should find some way to provide goods and services to people and provide meaning to people's lives that doesn't tie it all to employment for wages outside the home seems valuable.